The Department of Defense in the United States recently awarded a contract to an aerospace company to develop a concept of a moon based railroad network. Can there be military presence on the moon? What about weapons on a settlement on the lunar surface? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we talk about these issues and the Outer Space Treaty with Professor Michael Byers. Hello, and welcome to our series Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space, in particular, the moon. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Byers, and it is my honor to have a conversation with Professor Byers. He holds the Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia. He also co-directs the Outer Space Institute with an astronomer. So I think that I would add that. A global network of experts united by their commitment to transdisciplinary research that addresses grand challenges in the exploration and use of space. He's the author of International Law and the Arctic, which won the 2013 Donner Prize. And his latest book is Who Owns Outer Space? I think it's a relevant question, in which he co-authored with Dr. Aaron Boley. And again, he's the astronomer that I was referring to. So welcome, Professor Byers.
It is very good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start right in the sort of the middle of the story in some sense. Recently, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, commonly known as DARPA, just contracted an aerospace company, Northrop Grumman, to further develop the concept of a moon-based railroad network, which is a part of their 10-year study. And I'm just curious because this was just recently in the news. Obviously, it's an attractive headline: railroads on the moon, but built by a study funded by military research agency. How do you see that in the context of what you work on?
Well, I think that DARPA has far too much money and that Congress should take some of it away. This looks like science fiction to me. It could also be illegal under the Outer Space Treaty because military activities are prohibited on the moon. But the bigger question is, why are U.S. taxpayer dollars being spent on plans that will likely never be implemented, and if they are implemented, will be many decades away? We have really big challenges both on Earth and in space that require our attention right now. So yes, DARPA has too much money. They're spending it on science fiction. I'm not convinced that this is a good thing.
But there are plans, partly because of the existence of an establishment and the existence of Space Force. There are stated plans in terms of what is called CicLunar space, right? So between Earth and the moon. And in fact, one of the, I think he was the deputy of Space Force, he in fact had stated that basically that the boundary or the sphere of interest of Space Force extends to the far side of the moon. In fact, it was, I think, in the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, that Space Force signed with NASA. So there is interest in that. And I know that a lot of your work deals with low Earth orbit as well, where militarization has happened. And so doesn't that extend in some sense, even if we don't talk about the surface of the moon, but certainly around it?
Well, my own opinion is that we should not allow militaries to be involved in cislunar space or deep space at all. They're not involved yet. civilian space agencies like NASA have been involved in space since the 1960s in landing on the moon in 1969. All of the deep space probes doing science throughout the solar system. There is no military threat beyond Earth orbit. The challenges are enormous. Cooperation is the way forward. And we need to be talking about things like search and rescue, about how do we protect the radio quiet zone that currently exists on the far side of the moon and could be the future of deep space astronomy. There's a lot we need to do together. I understand that Space Force is looking for reasons to have larger budgets. But I would suggest that there's enough need on the surface of the Earth for surveillance, for communications, for Earth imaging, the kinds of things that militaries have done for decades, that the space dimension of military should stay where it is.
No, you did mention Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits not just weapons of mass destruction, which it explicitly does, but it also says that it prohibits the establishment of military bases, installations, and fortifications, testing of any type of weapons, and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies. That's what it prohibited. But there have been like at least one satellite that went to the moon, Clementine mission, that was funded partly by the Department of Defense. And right now, there are plans for potentially reconnaissance satellites. Do you think there is a distinction in the way Outer Space Treaty treats the surface of the moon? So again, those things, if they are on the surface, that differentiates it from the orbit. Or do you think it is sort of like, in the same range that it should not be there? And I agree with you that it should not be there, but do you think this is a loophole, or is this something that might happen?
The United States was one of the two principal negotiating states of the Outer Space Treaty. It's a Cold War treaty. The United States negotiated it with the Soviet Union at a time where both countries were trying to avoid a full-scale nuclear war. So at its heart, the Outer Space Treaty is a disarmament treaty. It's a treaty about keeping weapons out of space, about ensuring that space remains a peaceful domain. And the United States continues to support the Outer Space Treaty. Even the Artemis Accords, which I have some problems with, affirm the United States' commitment to the Outer Space Treaty. And yes, one can make legal arguments on either side of issues like, does the Outer Space Treaty extend to lunar orbits? But I would suggest that to be consistent with its long-standing commitment to the Outer Space Treaty, the United States should interpret these provisions in a broad way, in a way that supports peace and cooperation. So instead of trying to narrow the treaty through technical legal arguments that somehow suggest that the surface of the moon is not part of the same system as lunar orbits or the Lagrange points that are generated by the combination of the moon and Earth's gravities, that the Outer Space Treaty should be embraced as the model for this entire ecosystem that's created by the moon and the Earth in this wonderful gravitational dance that they engage in every single day, and which, of course, has made life on Earth possible.
So actually, if I can push you in the context, not for the orbit of the moon, but how do you think the low Earth orbit is going to extend out as we go further and further? Do you think, we're not talking, do you think there is a possibility that the expansion of satellites here on Earth in terms for reconnaissance, for fighting purposes as well, can they go all the way close to the lunar orbit but they are still focused on the Earth. I mean, that then the context becomes different. It's not about the moon, but it's about the Earth.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good question. Low Earth orbit is attractive because of its proximity to the surface of the planet, which almost eliminates any latency in the communication signal transmission, and also allows for higher resolution imagery. So having satellites at 550 kilometers, like SpaceX's Starlink, or at 800 kilometers, like Canada's RadarSat satellites, Earth imaging satellites. Low Earth orbit is valuable because of its proximity. As you go further out, you lose some of those advantages. You do get a big advantage at 36,000 kilometers, geosynchronous orbit, because you can put a communication satellite above a certain location on the planet, and they will both rotate in conjunction with each other, and so effectively the satellite looks stationary. It's good for communications. Going further out, yes, one can take advantage of orbits. We use transfer orbits to send things to the moon and back. For instance, it's possible to put spacecraft in orbit around Lagrange points, which are these points of relative gravitational stability. They're not, you don't park at a Lagrange point, you are in a big orbit around it. There's lots of room around a single Lagrange point. There's also a misconception that somehow you can occupy a Lagrange point. You cannot. There are many possible orbits. But the further that you get away, the further the utility for activities on the planet's surface. The reason for putting a satellite around a Lagrange point is to act as a communication relay to the far side of the moon or to the surface of the moon, although that's not necessary if you have a direct line of sight with Earth. The moon has a latency of about 2 seconds. But you could imagine putting a satellite in orbit around a Lagrange point for space situational awareness, to watch what is going on, or to install a telescope on a spacecraft around a Lagrange point to assist in the detection of potentially hazardous asteroids for planetary defense. There are some utilities, but there are no military utilities. There's no need to have military activities there unless you've convinced yourself that there's an adversary or a potential adversary who plans to get there first and do all kinds of nefarious things while you are absent. And one of my concerns at the moment is that people who want to see a larger budget for Space Force are whipping up this hysteria about Chinese intentions to militarize the moon and the area around the moon. And I have yet to find any evidence of those Chinese intentions. Now, I don't trust the Chinese government, but I seek to verify concerns. And so far, I think that a lot of the hysteria is generated by people who are looking for increased budgets and not actually doing the deep geopolitical analysis or actually engaging with Chinese experts and officials. There's a lot of assumptions that exist in this domain.
And I can just quote NASA chief also, Bill Nelson, who explicitly said, I think last year, that we have to be careful because China is going to get there first, and then it's going to say the moon is ours, and then it will be too late. So I mean, I think that is part of the thing. But do you worry about the fact that we talked about that the military as such would not have much benefit right now, but this hysteria can lead to China reacting to the United States? Because to a certain degree, I mean, like, for example, the DARPA project, and that's not the only one. There are others, a couple of other projects as well, which includes, for example, manufacturing on the moon, like, for whatever structures you want to create and things like that. Do you think that can trigger Chinese reaction, and that can by itself, unintended consequences can lead to militarization on the moon?
Well, the first thing to say is that the United States did not claim the moon in 1969.
Right.
It planted a flag, but there was no claim to territory. And that was because the United States had negotiated the Outer Space Treaty just 2 years earlier and promised to the Soviet Union and the rest of the world that there would be no, quote, national appropriation of the moon or other celestial bodies. And of course, the Soviet Union, China, India have all had rovers, landers on the moon, and there's been no claim. So no, I'm not worried about anyone, asserting that the moon is part of the People's Republic of China. In terms of your second question, though, in the discipline of international relations, there is a concept called the security dilemma, which involves one state existing in a situation of uncertainty about the motivations, the actions of a potential adversary. And in this situation of uncertainty, they decide on a precautionary basis to begin to build up their military capability. They don't want to be caught behind by surprise. So the thinking is that it's better to build up, if you're uncertain, to build up your military capability. Now, if the other state has not actually been doing anything nefarious, anything of concern, it's still going to see the state that's decided to engage in a precautionary buildup building up. And at that point, its only rational response is to start doing what it was suspected of doing in the first place. Yeah. So you can actually get an escalatory situation that grows out of nothing except for uncertainty. And so I would suggest that there is uncertainty in Washington concerning Chinese actions and motivations. And so the response to the uncertainty is to ask for larger budgets for Space Force. And yes, the Chinese government will be looking at this and saying, oh, well, we haven't been doing anything, but the Americans are, so we should build up also. And you can get this cycle. Now, the way that you break the security dilemma is through diplomacy, through transparency, and ideally through coordination and even cooperation. So to give a couple of examples, the United States invited Russia to participate in the International Space Station as a full partner shortly after the end of the Cold War, to bring them inside the tent, to do away with the suspicions concerning the Russian space program, by actually engaging fully. And that continues today. A Russian cosmonaut launched on a SpaceX Falcon 9 in, I think it was late March, early April, from Cape Canaveral, 2024. A couple of weeks later, an American astronaut launched on a Soyuz rocket from Baikonur, Kazakhstan. Again, April 2024. That cooperation continues today, despite the war in Ukraine, despite all of the sanctions. And with regards to China, we don't have that degree of cooperation, but we participate with China in the International Disasters Charter, which shares imagery, satellite imagery for assistance in situations of natural or man-made disasters. So, there's been some big floods in Russia in the last couple of months, and data has gone from European and Canadian satellites to the Russian government to assist in the disaster relief. We participate with China in the Cosmos-SARSAT search and rescue system, which uses satellites and ground-based beacons and beacons on airplanes and ships to save thousands of lives each year. China and the United States, China and Western countries are still cooperating in space, and one has to get into the details. One has to talk to the experts. One has to ideally read the Chinese literature and the Chinese documentation to dial down this concern, and then to look for opportunities, further opportunities for coordination and cooperation. That's how you break the security dilemma. That's how you stop an arms race. We actually did pretty well with this sort of thing during the Cold War. We engaged with the Soviet Union in space. For instance, the Apollo-Soyuz project in the 1970s. We found that in space we could work together. And so I would encourage those people who are concerned about China's actions and motivations in space to actually engage with Chinese experts to encourage diplomacy. It's the reason we have foreign ministries, the reason the United States has the State Department is so that we can talk to people rather than go to war with people. Sometimes you have to go to war, but you always seek to talk the situation down.
But I think it gets. I mean, it's interesting that you use the example of the International Space Station because China wanted to join the International Space Station, but it was actually prevented from it, and there is a congressional act associated with prohibiting NASA, for example, from directly collaborating with China, and that is part of the cycle in some sense. I mean, in some areas it does do that, but in general, there is this threat, and that has led to China's, in some sense, independence in terms of the space development, including its own space station.
Yes, there's truth in that, but it's also true that NASA quite regularly gets waivers to the Wolf Amendment, the prohibition on cooperation. NASA does cooperate with the Chinese Space Agency. It just does so on the basis of ad hoc waivers. We don't have a partnership on the International Space Station with China, but one could imagine future cooperation opportunities. So, for instance, there are incredible science opportunities on the moon. To think about radio astronomy from the far side of the moon, to do science on the water ice that is in the deep craters at the lunar poles. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Western countries and China agreed to do a collaborative science mission, a purely science mission, with the goal of advancing human knowledge and also improving communication, coordination, collaboration between these major spacefaring countries?
In fact, one of the exemptions that recently NASA got was to study the rock samples that China got from one of its Chang'e missions, and so that was actually one of the exceptions. And they was like, "Oh, okay, you can study that." Absolutely. So, can I ask you? You mentioned something about the Artemis Accord, and you mentioned that you have some reservations regarding that. I'm curious because, in some sense, this is another place where China has its collaborative. China, Russia, a bunch of other countries are part of its lunar research cooperation. And then you have the American-led Artemis Accord, which has, I think, close to, I don't know, the current total, 39 or so countries signed to that. But you also mentioned that you have some reservations regarding that. I'm curious, what are those? What are those reservations?
Well, my main reservation concerning the Artemis Accords is I find it difficult to imagine China or Russia signing the Artemis Accords. So it inherently creates fragmentation in the international space governance system. And we have an international mechanism for this. The space treaties of the 1960s and 70s were negotiated in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And then those treaties were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly and opened for ratification. Now, one of the remarkable things about space is that this UN body is still functioning. It meets in Vienna every year. It has subcommittees that do important work. And it actually has created a working group on space resources. And so China, Russia, the United States, European countries, India are all sitting around a table, a conference room, negotiating on these issues, and multilateral negotiation between unfriendly countries takes a lot of time and it's a lot of work, but it can deliver substantial results. And the Artemis Accords, because they're being signed by countries that are friendly to the United States, are moving more rapidly. There was no negotiation about the text of the Artemis Accords. It was an American document that it then persuaded first of all, its closest allies to sign, and then somewhat less close allies. But it's not multilateralism. And if you want to solve these problems for the long term, you need to bring the difficult players together. You need to have an agreed result that includes China, that includes the United States, includes India, and yes, even includes Russia. You know, if we had this conversation back in the early 1960s during the Cold War, and I said, look, we need an outer space treaty, and we need to see a negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union, most people would have laughed, thought it inconceivable. And yet we got a constitution for space. And then we did it again in the early 1980s. We got the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Constitution for the Oceans, Cold War treaties that have lasted, that have served humanity very well. Relations with China are not great, but they're still a lot better than the relations were with the Soviet Union. So I remain an optimist, and the Artemis Accords are a bit of a distraction. They're unfortunately pushing towards fragmentation. So I would prefer that they did not exist. They exist. I can't turn back time. But I do like to point out to people that first of all, they are explicitly non-binding. They are not legal documents. And secondly, they reaffirm the commitment of all the signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. There are interpretive differences concerning certain provisions, but the Artemis Accords are a non-legally binding affirmation of the legally binding instrument, which is the Outer Space Treaty.
Do you think, I mean, that's an interesting aspect, that your criticism is actually based upon the fact what the sort of like the mechanism is, and that is producing fragmentation for the Artemis Accord. So do you think that the way things are going, what is the likelihood that I mean, do you think there is a likelihood that it will get subsumed within the United Nations conversations of modified outer space treaty? Or do you think we are right now on a path that you would have a very different body, Artemis Accord or Chinese protocol regarding that?
Yeah, I can't imagine a modified outer space treaty that didn't include all of the major spacefaring countries. So China and Russia have to be there. But you know, the other thing to say is that you know, despite the Artemis Accords, what is the foreseeable coordination challenge on the moon? It's a US actor, either NASA or a US company, probably under contract with NASA, and the Chinese Space Agency or a Chinese company working with the Chinese Space Agency. So the coordination challenge is going to be between the United States and China, realistically speaking. Maybe India, right? But most likely China and the United States. At that point, the Artemis Accords are irrelevant, right? Because China is not a signatory. The coordination will be negotiated bilaterally between those two countries. And the future will build on that. The Artemis Accords they're great. They've started the conversation. They've increased awareness of these issues. They've advanced a debate as to what role do we allow commercial actors to play in terms of space resource extraction. And that's all positive. I'm not an enemy of the Artemis Accords. I just want people to realize that they're not the main game in town. The main game in town is the relationship between the United States and China and the necessary coordination that will take place.
And there is conversations going on about, for example, the standard time on the moon. And so there's a different type of measurement that you need to do because time ticks slightly differently on the moon. And those conversations are going on with basically the major space agencies of the world, and not within Artemis or within that.
And there is a remarkable international organization, indeed the oldest international organization of all, created back in the 1860s, the International Telecommunication Union. It started as the International Telegraph Union. It changed its name to reflect newer technologies. But the International Telecommunication Union has been working on lunar time for a while. And someone in the White House wasn't aware that the ITU was doing this, right? That's just a reflection that busy people in government are seldom aware of everything. But we'll solve this problem. We have an international organization. China, Russia, India, the United States are all party to the ITU. We'll get a standard time for the moon. We solve so many problems in space. The ITU is also responsible for the assignment of a radio spectrum. So is working very closely with national regulators like the U.S. Federal Communications Commission to ensure that there is not undue interference between all of these new satellites that are being launched. There's a lot more governance in space than people realize, and most of it is cooperative. A lot of it is scientific. More and more of it is commercial. There's a lot of military activity, but that military activity is not about fighting war in space. It's about communications and Earth imagery in support of operations on the ground. So everyone can take a deep breath. The moon is not going to become militarized anytime soon. And we simply need to look at the situation with the most informed perspective possible, which is a lot of this concern in Washington is driven by the normal fight for bureaucratic turf and budgetary increases. China is not moving aggressively to claim the moon. We need to study Chinese motives. We need to engage with China. And at some point, we'll need to re-engage with Russia. We are engaged to a limited degree on the International Space Station and on things like search and rescue. But whatever happens, Russia is and will remain a space power. And we need to work with India because India has been a space power for a long time because it realized very early on the utility of space to agriculture. India is a major player, and we need to make sure that it is treated as a major player and is encouraged to adopt the best practices that are being advanced in places like Europe and the United States.
You mentioned commercial interest, like now that is becoming more and more important. And in your book also, you talk about space mining. And so mining on the moon, of course, also comes into play. And outer space treaty, of course, there is this aspect that you cannot own any piece of the celestial bodies, including the moon. However, there has been more in the last few years, and that starts from President Obama as well, who authorized, again, that was an act, and it was passed by the Congress, where the idea was that if there is an extract from on the moon or on asteroids and things like that, a company can make profit off of the extract. So you don't still own the moon or the asteroid, but you own the extract. How do you see that? And in terms of outer space treaty, in terms of NASA recently, I think in 2022, gave a contract to one of the companies in Texas it was a dollar contract to dig up regolith, move it to another place, and that, if I remember correctly, one of the explicit reasons is to potentially challenge OSTs or outer space treaties aspect to that. So how do you see that element playing in it?
Well, Professor Boley in my book has a lengthy, exhaustive interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty and its provisions that could concern space mining. And at the end of this treaty interpretation, we come to the conclusion that the issue is not actually dealt with in the Outer Space Treaty, that the issue was left for a later year, that back in 1967, they didn't need to come to a definitive conclusion on the issue of commercial space mining or the pursuit of profit in the extraction of resources. And so the United States is doing what what powerful countries often do in international law, which is that it's advancing its preferred legal position. And in this case, it's seeking to persuade other states to adopt an interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty that is favorable to commercial space mining. I'm a general international lawyer. I don't just study space law. I have seen this game played dozens of times before. They have put forward a proposition. Other states are responding to it. It just so happens that the states who are responding favorably are close allies of the United States or dependent on the United States. But the law won't be made or changed until the other major spacefaring powers have their say. International law applies among 193 different nation states. And in space, you need to give particular weight and respect to the major actors to change the law. So the United States is advancing a proposition. Russia has objected, said, no, we're not going to do this. And China has taken a more nuanced position. The negotiations are underway on this issue, is what I'm saying. But the negotiations aren't reflected in the discussions between the United States and its allies. Again, the discussion comes back to, what are China and the United States, and to some degree, India and other major space powers going to want to have as a legal result. The game is on, but it's not yet over. We will see some kind of commercial space mining regime in the future. It could conceivably require authorization from an international body like the International Seabed Authority for deep sea mining. It might be a national permitting process within certain agreed rules, but there need to be rules. There need to be rules on the prevention of the lofting of lunar dust, which could be highly destructive to other activities. I mean, what happens if you're landing big SpaceX starships on the surface of the moon? Can you imagine the amount of regolith and lunar dust that would be kicked up and potentially drift around the entire moon, reaching its very fragile atmosphere? Or think about, other issues like the protection of cultural heritage. We can't have mining operations near the Apollo 11 landing site. Can you imagine the Apollo 11 landing site covered up by, a centimeter of lunar dust because someone landed a rocket 50 kilometers away? We need to make sure that this is not with regards to the moon, but with regards to asteroids, that if a company is mining an asteroid, it doesn't change the trajectory of the asteroid inadvertently through the act of removing mass, because the asteroid by definition will be a near-Earth asteroid. So a trajectory change could turn it into a potential Earth impactor. And in a worst case scenario, by not regulating the space mining company properly in a precautionary way, you could end up with a cataclysmic situation where an entire continent could be rendered unlivable. That's a worst case scenario, but my point is that our enthusiasm for space, and I am a space enthusiast, has to be done in a way that is informed by science and is seeking always to identify and mitigate risk. And part of what I see with the discussion concerning space mining is so much enthusiasm that people have lost this perspective, have lost the necessary caution. And with caution comes the necessary element of oversight. And whether the oversight is multinational or national, it very much needs to be there. We have a long history on Earth of unregulated or poorly regulated companies doing very damaging things. And we have the opportunity to avoid that outcome in space.
I think, and I cannot agree more with you. So I'm from Pakistan, and so we have the history of British East India Company, for example, and not to mention in North America, there is a long history of commercial interests driving people out. And And that is the primary concern in terms of, even if we prioritize commercial interests, not military, but that kind of a loophole, even if it gets in a conversation between China and the United States, but that is still an issue. And I think you mentioned multiple times, I mean, the regolith issue with the sites of Apollo and other things, but also if there is mining going on and you have radio telescopes, for example, on the far side of the moon or other places, how do we decide in terms of what do we prioritize? And I think that is where all of our voices need to be. And in that context, if I can ask you, and we're close to the end, people have argued, and which is not a United Nations treaty, but it was multinational, and that is the Antarctic Treaty. And in fact, just recently, philosopher A.C. Grayling has a book out, Who Owns the Moon, in which he explicitly makes the argument, well, I mean, that turned out to be, for various reasons, political reasons, like it turned out to be a pretty good treaty to a certain degree, and Antarctica has acted as a place for where science takes, in some sense, priority. And you don't have militarization, you don't have resource extraction, you don't have it in the same way. How do you see something like that for the moon? Is it possible? And who knows whether Antarctic Treaty, what is its future? But overall, do you think something like that can happen on the moon?
Hmm. Many of the diplomats who negotiated the Outer Space Treaty had previously negotiated the Antarctic Treaty. So there is some continuity between the Antarctic Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty. And so it is a useful model in some respects. I look more, however, to the oceans as my primary source of analogies, of lessons. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea codified centuries of state practice as countries learned to work together in a domain that was beyond national jurisdiction, that had resources, not just mineral resources on the ocean floor, but also biological resources, fish in the water column, that involved long voyages, issues of search and rescue, issues of managing corporations that are operating beyond the reach of their own governments, right? I mean, SpaceX is becoming the East Asia company of the 21st century, right? With all of the challenges that come with that. So far, however, it cannot colonize another human population. So at least some of the worst aspects of what happened will not happen again. But the law of the sea provides a very powerful set of examples as to how we might move forward. We have an effective international organization, the International Maritime Organization, that involves the maritime industries at the table. So it's a cooperative mechanism between states and industry. It's highly effective in terms of safety standards. The reason we have double-hulled oil tankers instead of single-hull oil tankers, the reason why we have covered lifeboats instead of open lifeboats. I mean, the list goes on and on. The reason why we have search and rescue obligations goes all the way back to the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic, and 2 years later, the adoption of the Convention on the Safety of Life at Sea. So I look for analogies there, but ultimately outer space is unique. It's sui generis. We're going to have to come up with some new solutions also. But I tell young people, and Professor Boley and I paid an open access fee so that any young person anywhere in the world can read our book for free. Just go to the Cambridge University Press website and download the PDF. Because these young people who are the future of humanity in space need to know that there's a lot of existing law, there's a lot of existing cooperation, there's a lot of need for future cooperation. Space is hard. We need to work together. And there's the opportunity to do it right in space. which I find incredibly invigorating. I mean, I can look at the history of how humanity has screwed up on multiple occasions here on the planet, and I can take lessons from that as we move forward, as we expand into space. This is, to my mind, the most exciting topic imaginable. The moon is our first stop. Let's get it right on the moon, and then we'll get it right on Mars, and then we'll move into deep space. And let's do it in a cooperative manner, because ultimately, the further we go out into the universe, the more our commonality will become apparent, right? We are one species, we are one people. And when we realize that, this pale blue dot in the universe is what unites us, then our opportunities are limitless, and I'm very excited by them.
Well, that's a great note to stop, and I should mention that. I mean, in some sense, I mean that's why we are having this conversation as well, because Moon is also going to set a precedence of how. That's why I mean, sort of like it's really crucial to really think through, and it is actually really wonderful that this book, "Who Owns Outer Space," is actually available. People can actually download it. I'm going to provide a link in the description of the video. So I did not know that, and that's really fantastic. And so yeah, so thank you very much, and I really appreciate your really positive, optimistic outlook as well, because I think, as you mentioned, space can bring the best of us, and I think that's what we should hope for, and not the worst, which we are also unfortunately quite capable as well.
I'm glad we agree. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.